So guys, before we start, just a reminder to the audience to keep your voice down for the page and the phones. You're going to exit the room, exit in between speeches, not during speeches. Debaters as well as having the phone. So, congratulations on getting into the semi-finals of IMU Debate Open 2014. Site opening government, we have PPUA, opening government, we have Cannilingus, opening opposition, we have Mara A, and closing opposition, we have UPN1. And the motion, this House believes that Israel should not officially declare itself as a Jewish state. I would like to invite the Prime Minister to start the mediation.
At the time that we're in status quo, we believe the motion is presented today is something we should completely agree to, right? So today, as the Prime Minister, I would make some clarification because I have a lot of things to explain. First clarification is that we as the government have nothing against Israel being a normal state. We're fine if Israel is a secular state. The only thing we want to clarify is to make sure that there are significant harms that we can actually face if we call ourselves a Jewish state. So as Prime Minister today, I'll explain to you what our objectives are, right? We as the government, our objectives are simple. That we want to prove to you why calling ourselves a Jewish state is a trade-off that we cannot make at this time and at this situation that we are in the status quo, right? So this is our main objective for the whole debate. And another further clarifications would be made throughout my whole case. Today, as the Prime Minister, I have four arguments to make, right? My first argument would be identifying the problem with Israel. So identifying the problem with Israel. My second argument would be talking about the empowerment of rhetorics. And third argument being that how our allies would start to leave us, and our fourth argument being the domestic policy that we already have in Israel. So first of all, as the state of Israel, first we have to identify our problem, right? First of all, we must consider the fact in status quo we are already vulnerable. Because why? We're already alienated at where we are at the moment, right? Because everybody alienates us because we are perceived as a Jewish state, even though we are not really an extremist Jewish state. We are perceived by everyone on that factor, right? So what this perceived value actually did to us is that it further alienated us in the status quo and thus making us more vulnerable. Now sit down. This made us much more vulnerable in the status quo as we are, right? And this is something we should take into consideration, that our vulnerability is something we should consider when acting out such things, right? We are alienated, and how can we see proofs that we are actually really alienated? Let's talk about what the Gaza incident, right? Nobody cared about what the Hamas did, right? Everybody was talking about how messed up Israeli was and having posts all over social network and having talks in the news of how we are the criminals and how it's all our fault in the end that we are making these mistakes and how Gaza is completely innocent. Nobody talked about the Hamas, right? And how they tried to harm us instead, and how we're actually just trying to protect ourselves and our people, right? Nobody talked about that. This is the extent of the alienation, that nobody cares about the acts that we do on secularity, but everybody conceives the act that we do on basing us on ideology, right? Because now everybody condemns us on ideology. Nobody took the Gaza war as something we did as a secular act. Everybody thought we acted based on ideology. They made it a Jew versus Islam war, right? Which is already the perseveration over there. But we're not doing these kind of things, right? We are acting on secularity. So this is how vulnerable we already become. So I'll move on to my second argument, which is the empowerment of rhetoric. But before that, I'll take opening.
Does Israel lose its moral legitimacy because it's belligerent or because it's a Jewish state?
No, see, I already proved to you it's alienated already. So the moral values are already very low, but it will become much more lower if you further enhance ourselves and fall into their perceivance and alienate ourselves much more, right? So I'll talk about the second argument, which is the empowerment of rhetorics, right? First of all, we must consider the fact in the status quo, we already have this so-called Jew haters, right? Which are already already there talking about us, right? So I already explained to you how these wars are actually perceived as an ideological war, that we are not actually acting on secularity. Everybody, so what actually happens is that we empower these Jew haters, because now they can actually say that yes, we are acting out on Jewish ideologies rather than the secular ideas that we actually have, the rational ideas that we actually have, the basic secular ideas that we're actually acting on, right? Everybody would think that it's only the Jewish and Jewish ideas that we are actually following, and Jewish idea that we're actually following and continuing upon, right? So it empowers the rhetoric, and which is really harmful and further enhances our alienation and contributes to my first argument, right? So I'll move on to my third argument, right, which is that all of our allies would start to leave. One thing about Israel is that all of our allies are secular allies, right? Like the US, we have secular allies. So we must consider the fact that if we want to maintain our relationship with our allies, we must maintain our secular state motto and be a secular state, right? Because this is one of the reasons why these allies are with us, and this is one of the reasons why, even though we're that vulnerable, we are still protected by our allies, right? Something we can have to help us when we're in need, right? So when we add this kind of idea, the whole idea of us being a complete Jewish state, we remove the whole idea of secularity. We introduce the ideological state values that comes from our Jewish nature, right? So this actually eliminates the whole idea of secularity, and what actually happens? Our allies start to leave. Something we cannot afford to happen, because our allies are with us because we have the secular mindset, and they believe in us that whatever we're doing is based on secularity and something that can be justified and rationalized by them, right? Something not that's just based on ideologies and just because they think we hate Muslims, right? That's why they're with us in the end and until the end. So what we'd actually do is that I'll move on to my fourth argument, which actually is the significance, which will actually ensure the significance of the debate, right? Which is the domestic policy that we have in Israel. One of the biggest thing is that we must consider, even though we being a Jewish state, we still have these minorities who are actually Muslim, right? We cannot just say these Muslims don't have a bigger role, because already we're perceived as something, right? So, and there are also consideration of the tension that we have in Israel itself amongst the Jewish and the Muslim that we actually have in our state, right? So what actually happens is that when we have these non-Jews, it's clear that when we actually allow this motion, we actually propose, do not allow this motion to pass, what will actually happen is that we clearly show that we don't care about these non-Muslims that are in the state. So what actually ensures is that we empower the rhetoric. This also further empowers the things I've talked about in my previous arguments. And what actually happens is all the other countries actually gets really angry at us, right? That we don't care about the minorities, Muslims that we actually have. And another additional thing that actually happens is the Human Rights Watch. Now we start to get scrutinized by UN and other Human Rights Watch because they say that we don't have minoritical rights, right, in our state, and we don't care about the Arabs that we actually have in our state, because we empower the tension that we already have between the Jews and the Muslims that we have in the state. And because of this, this opens the door for these watches, human rights watches, to further scrutinize us with all of these possible harms that will actually occur if we if we call ourselves a Jewish state. We believe it's something we should not do, and we are proud to propose as APOA.
I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for the speech. To now take start the case, leader of opposition.
Shalom. This motion is a form of emotional robbery, and this is an unfair pressure by the international community telling a minority of people in this world to drop an extension of their identity. We will never stand for this anti-Semitism. This debate is not about condoning the conflict or abuse done by the Jewish state, but this debate is about whether the Jewish state have the same right as any other state in the world to affiliate themselves with an identity. And we believe that Israel has the right to affiliate themselves as a Jewish state. What I'm going to talk about in today's debate, I'm going to talk about two things: how sovereignty leads the right to the political autonomy to choose what identity states want to affiliate themselves to. And number two, I'm going to talk about how this is a form of reparation if you allow Israel to continuously identify themselves as a Jewish state. But let's look where OG missed this debate. Firstly, they spoke about how this would be better for the international community, or how is Israel perceived within the international community. Firstly, is that Israel as a Jewish state, because the majority of them are Jewish, the perception that they are Jews will never change. That means that, but however, the state would not associate terrorism with the Jews or whatever acts in the past done by the Jews, unless you are a bastardist anti-Semite state. So the question that Muayyad brought upon here was really important. Are we losing allies because we are Jews or because we are belligerent? We believe it is the latter. And just because you have that identity does not mean you have to lose it because somebody would somehow associate with. The problem here is that if it is based on international pressure and somehow you still change, you rob people of the ability to identify themselves. And Israel as a state is different because the existence of Jew as a race or religion is contingent on the existence of this homeland itself and how it is actually given to them in the past according to God. But lastly, that logic also means that no state should ever have any form of affiliation because you have a certain sense of, because you abuse human rights in the past. That means states like Tunisia shouldn't be Muslim at all, just because in the past we do some kind of form of human rights. Or China shouldn't affiliate themselves with communism because that's the perception we have of communism at the end of the day. It is ridiculous to say that we are going to judge a person's idea based on the acts of several different people. Here's the second part. He said that we will lose secular allies. Look, America has allied themselves with many Muslim states in the past. We don't think it's not mutually exclusive in this sense. You just have to have good behavior. But their last rant over here they had was according to their domestic policy, that if you have minorities, you need to stop associating yourselves with a certain race or with a certain religion. Look, just because you're a Jew, you're a Muslim in a Jewish state, does not mean you can't actually practice your religion. Just like how I am a Christian, but does not mean I must stop my religious belief in Malaysia. And it also does not mean the Jewish state does not care about the Arab population. Just like how we have affirmative action for them even to get into high school to some extent, to get into the better schools, because we believe those kind of integration within it, and it's not mutually exclusive to the idea of national integration. In fact, if we are not happy with integration in general, we can have better inclusive textbooks or better television representation. Before I move on to my argumentation, yes, Shafiq.
Israel. Don't you think this will help the Palestinian diaspora?
That's the problem with the Likud party, not the problem of the Jewish race. You have to make that distinction. Simple as that, Shafiq. I'm sorry that you have to ask that POI. Ask a better one next time. First argument, our states have sovereignty, thus have the autonomy to affiliate themselves with whatever identity they want. Firstly, with sovereignty, people have the political will and independence to actually see what is the extension of their personal beliefs, because the state represents who you are, and somehow when somebody reflects you on your behalf, you have the right to determine so. That's why we allow democracy, we allow representational democracy, so that people have a chance to change whatever policy represents you, and you have the obligation to do so. The same extension applies when it comes to freedom of religion or freedom of expression, because people can't force on what you should believe in. The same when it comes to the Jewish state. If the majority of the people are Jewish, that means they have the right, the political right to have other people perceive them as a Jewish person when they call themselves an Israeli. The fact also matters that Israel is the only Jewish state in existence in the world, when there are many other states that are Muslim or Christian. And we permit that even in the first world, who we agree the existence of the state, and we still do trade by them. The problem is that if you disallow the single Jewish state in this world to stop existing, that is where their identity as a nation get engulfed by others. But the difference here is that Israel whole position in the culture of Israel, because the very existence that they have a home in terms of in terms of Zionism, in the sense that I have a place to go to in comparison to other races. And a lot of races also have geographical boundaries, but yet we still recognize those kind of things. Now that they have a place to call home instead, and some place to look to. Because in the past, the Jewish race were constantly perceived as visitors and only temporarily staying in other countries like in Europe. So this translates to a form of psychological discomfort, saying that I am constantly a visitor to another place rather than having a geographical origin at first. So when you remove that tag, you encourage that psychological discomfort. That is why we permit Mecca to exist as a Muslim state, the Vatican to exist as a Catholic vessel, or Tibet even to exist as a Buddhist state, even though we already have civic nationalism. So the benefits here comes on twofold. Is that firstly, we allow a form of psychological comfort of view as when you have a cultural identity, and lastly, we don't bar people from having an extension to the identity and that extension in the state. But lastly, here's also what's important, is that when it comes to reparations, we have to agree that in the past that countries like Germany has did wrong to the Jewish race and how we systematically oppressed them in the past. Now, the existence of in Israel is a form of guarantee, the existence of a form of reparation where you constantly are able to practice your culture within a safe place. Now, we may also agree that somehow in first world countries, that these people also have a chance to actually somehow demonstrate their faith or retain their culture within America or Britain. But the difference here is that when it's Israel, you have a form of guarantee that is not dictated by other people. When you have other countries like Muslim countries who are able to dictate their comfort in their own state and how they want to live the state, live throughout the state as an extension of that identity, we think Israel should receive the right like any other nation in this world already have. Please vote for OO for protection of identity.
To thank the leader of opposition for the speech for the case, Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Sorry, MIDP. All right. We told you that this debate is not about if you have a right to call yourself whatever you want to call. This debate is not about preserving your identity, basically, because we don't think preserving your identity exclusive to calling yourself something, ladies and gentlemen. This debate is about what is the best strategic decision that you would make at this particular point of time. What are the outcomes of that particular decision? They just come here and give you a theoretical of what rights are, what sovereignty is, which is absolutely true, and we are not going to negate that. But when they fail to engage in this debate, is to bring tangible outcomes, to prove and take a burden in this debate, ladies and gentlemen. Opening opposition is all of this debate. I'm going to talk to you about three things in my speech. Firstly, I want to talk to you about the domestic policies, that how it would affect and empowers the rhetoric of Hamas, specifically when it comes to recruitment of more extremists, and how it encourages extremism. Secondly, I want to talk to you about the whole idea of the protest capital, that we have a limited protest capital that we are already losing in the international community, and we should not lose that further. And lastly, I'll be talking to you about the perception of Israel. Raihan talked to you about a lot of stuff. I'm going to reinforce it further. They didn't engage me. Just because he's an M, that doesn't mean he doesn't make sense, right? That's my argument. He makes absolute sense. But let's again, their argument. Democracy is representative. Here's a couple of examples of democracy. Malaysia. It's a democracy. You have parliament, you have government. You, Mr. Speaker, are very well discriminated in a democracy. Just because you have a democracy, that doesn't mean we magically preserve your rights, right? There are still minorities that are good. Iran is a democracy. Bahrain is a democracy. Just because you call yourself democracy and hide under cover, that doesn't mean you necessarily do whatever thing, right? Then they come here and they tell you that we have to preserve our identity, right? See, Turkey is an Islamic country. They have preserved the Islamic nation, but they call themselves themselves a secular state. They don't call themselves an Islamic country. But let's look at other countries. Like Iran, they call themselves an Islamic country. The political capital that Turkey is able to garner under the cover of secular state is way more than the political capital that we have been able to gain throughout the thing. Then they come here and talk about psychological comfort, right? That's a very problem that we have, because they only consider the psychological comfort of Jewish people within Israel, ladies and gentlemen. That comfort comes at the cost of discomfort of a lot of my Arab brothers within that country. We think that's unjust, ladies and gentlemen. That's a psychological discomfort that we should not come. That's not a cost that we are willing to pay. Let's look at the first argument, right? Domestic policies and the narrative that already exists. There is a tension within our own countries, right? It's not a fairy tale that Terence want to portray. For God's sake, for Allah's sake, it's Israel, ladies and gentlemen, right? There is already tension among Arab people, among Jewish people, right? Not just within Israel, but even within West Bank and within Gaza that we have. The moment that you further make it an ideological war, making it Jewish war, ladies and gentlemen, then now Arabs are definitely excluded from your paradigm, and now you're giving a reason and incentive to be angry at you, because they are legitimately excluded from all your policies, and they are legitimately excluded. Now you're going to increase tension. Now you're giving a rhetoric. You empower the rhetoric of Hamas. Let's see, this is an ideological war, right? So the problem with that is that now Hamas is always going to be right because they are the ones who are Muslim and they are not Jewish. For Hamas, they don't need to debate and prove anything. They just need to be Muslim to be right at the end of the day, because they are fighting those Jew bastards who came and took our land, ladies and gentlemen. The ideological affiliation brings more harm, brings domestic tension, create inferiority and superiority concept. Look at Malaysia, the Putra policy the policies that you have, ladies and gentlemen, in this country, which is unfavorable to the majority of your country, in long term has caused a lot of problems within the racial reconciliation that you are going to have. These are the problems that we are going to have in Israel, and we are going to further exacerbate it further in this idea, ladies and gentlemen. Don't give Hamas a reason to recruit further members, right? Don't empower the rhetorics. Don't empower them further. This is not an ideological fight. We are fighting for land. We are fighting for what deserves, ladies and gentlemen. Don't make it hard to reconcile. Well, let's look at the second argument that I want to bring to you in this debate. The protest capital that we have in international community is definitely limited, right? See, we are already alienated. Now, USA, they don't defend us when invade Gaza. They just say, we are going to be the mediator. We mediate and moderate the stuff that's going to happen. We don't get any direct support from our allies at the moment. What that means? That means that we are already losing our protest capital. Everyone is, oh, now wait, like they already are using the Jewish card. They are using the Holocaust card. They are other cards. People don't listen to us anymore, ladies and gentlemen. And it's very important for us to spare that political capital that we have. See, the debate is not about it's not about mutual exclusivity. It's about the degree of efficacy, right? Even if I want to be belligerent, I get to be more successful as a secular belligerent state. Look at the United States of America. But even if I become less belligerent, still the less belligerent of me, if it's secular, is more successful. It has any ideological affiliation. The debate is not a dichotomy, ladies and gentlemen, but it's about the degree and the efficacy of that. But now we have actual problems, right? We have Hamas, which is being perceived as an innocent son in the particular region, right? See, those are the actual problems. The problem that we have over land. We have to use our political capital to fight terrorism within the region, to fight land problems that we have, to fight to fight like the serious issues, that the actual problems that we have. We should not waste our political capital over something that it would bring harm to us in the future. We have to spare and allocate the political capital that we can garner in the future. Before I go ahead.
Now, justify to us, why is it the wrongs with the policy allows the retraction of a certain level, especially when you are a singular state with that identity?
Ladies and gentlemen, just being like that's a problem. Like that's a problem that I have with Netanyahu as well. Nothing is about outcomes. Everything is about the instant short-term pride that they get. See, we are the only Jewish state. But that comes at the great comes at the harms that I have talked to you, the harms that Raihan talked to you, and they fail to engage. It's harmful. Yes, you get to call yourself a Jewish state. You feel good about yourself. But tomorrow, you're going to get fucked up. You're going to be like Malaysia, right? See, let's look at here, right? The idea that we have, the perception of Israel, right? See, now Israel is perceived, and the Israeli war is perceived as a Jewish motive, right? It's not because of an Israeli motive, right? It's not a just war. It's not being perceived as a just war. Specifically in a scenario that we have our enemies like Iran, like Saudi Arabia and Arabs, they're becoming more moderate. We are losing our excuse to garner political capital, right? That's not a mistake that we should make. All those excuses are not working anymore, ladies and gentlemen. We have to move forward that. The war is not a Jewish war anymore, ladies and gentlemen. So don't let them to perceive us as a Jewish war. Don't let them to perceive our incentives as a Jewish motive. Because if they perceive our war and incentive as Jewish and ideologically affiliated one, now it's going to degrade and devalue the efficacy of what we are doing in this debate. We are very proud to win this debate.
Thank the Deputy Prime Minister for the speech. Now continue with our case, Deputy Leader of Opposition.
I'm sorry to the live stream audience in Malaysia that had to sit through Behrad's rant about necessarily Malaysia's domestic policies and tying that similarly to Israel. I feel that is a bit insulting, but let's move on to the debate, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, before I move on to my substantive, how the removal of identity as a Jewish state harms the concept of nationalism and essentially how that harms Israel's mobility within the state, let's deal with a couple of rebuttals coming from side opening government. Because the first rebuttal that they had was that essentially we're not contextualized to debate. That essentially the removal of the Jewish label is like they wanted us to debate that why it would be a strategic move. Essentially, if you listen to Terence's nuances and Terence's speech, we told you exactly why the removal of the Jewish state label is extremely harmful to Israel, because it's the only Jewish state in the country, ladies and gentlemen. This harms and this creates a psychological harm to any person who identifies himself with the Jewish culture, because there is no place for them to go later on. There is no place for them to worship. There is no place for them to go to associate themselves with, Ms. Speaker. And it's extremely harmful because acknowledging the fact that the Jewish state, that Israel was a form of reparation to our crimes that we have done on the Jewish people, Ms. Speaker. We acknowledge this as a form of reparation, but secondly as a place to call home, Ms. Speaker. That's why in light of the bad treatment that Malaysian Jews get, Ms. Speaker, if you walk into Israel now, you can still find Malaysian Jews in Israel, Ms. Speaker, because it's a place they associate themselves with. It's a place of identification, Ms. Speaker. The removal of the label of a Jewish state, it doesn't solve any of the problems that Israel face now, because the main problem that comes from opening government is with regards to domestic policy and belligerence, Ms. Speaker, and with regards to Hamas always affiliating themselves with a war on religion. Let's deal with this, right? Are you going to deter Hamas from attacking Israel? Why does Hamas attack Israel, Ms. Speaker? We think on several reasons. Firstly, because of the massive land grab that happened. Secondly, because they tie the war to religion. And thirdly, because of the past harms that Israel has done onto them, Ms. Speaker. So the first rebuttal we have to them is removing the label of a Jewish state ever going to remove all those harms, Ms. Speaker? Is the removal of a Jewish state going to change the fact that most of your population are Jewish, hence creating the visceral perception that your state is still a Jewish state? Secondly, will the removal of the Jewish label also mean that all the land that you've taken back is given back to the Palestinians, Ms. Speaker? And thirdly, is the removal of the Jewish state going to ever make the past harms that you inflicted on Hamas any better, Ms. Speaker? It doesn't. And in the absence of this, Hamas will always have a reason to attack Israel. So that point that Behrad brought up is moot, Ms. Speaker. So the Jews are more, so you still don't change the facts on the ground. You still don't change anything with regards to the perception of the Jewish state as Israel as a Jewish state, Ms. Speaker. But secondly, if Hamas does recruit on the basis of religion, as Behrad comes up to and tell you, Ms. Speaker, we think that gives us more political ammo against Hamas, Ms. Speaker. Essentially, if you recruit based on the lines of religion to attack another religion, Ms. Speaker, then first world countries will always ban under the fact that we have to respect other ideologies. We cannot discriminate them, Ms. Speaker, and we cannot attack on religious lines, Ms. Speaker. So that's perfect political ammo against Hamas or against any anti-Semitic state who thinks that being Jewish is wrong for Israel, Ms. Speaker, because you don't change the problem on the ground. he didn't respond to the fact that states have the ability or should have the right to identify itself with a culture that it's entitled to, Mr. Speaker. Because under their proposal, then states like Iran, states like Iraq should never identify themselves under the guise of Islam, Mr. Speaker, essentially because it's more strategic for them to do so. We think strategy is an ambiguous term. We don't think that strategy can immediately be quantified and translate into results, because we still cannot see any benefit coming from their side just because Israel no longer calls themselves a Jewish state, Mr. Speaker. We think that's just flawed reasoning coming from Behrad. But before I move on, yeah.
See, the reason that Kishan is here is not because Malaysia calls itself an Indian state, right? It's because there is a Malaysian culture, because there is his family out here. The same psychological comfort can be provided under an inclusive secular identity in Israel.
No, why can't that same structure exist under a state that calls itself a Jewish state as well, Mr. Speaker? We can still provide affirmative action. We can still provide protection under you. If you're, if, for example, in Islamic states, we have that as well. In Christian states, we have that as well, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that's mutually exclusive to the fact that you label yourself under a form of religion, Mr. Speaker. We think just because you're associated to a religion doesn't mean you immediately have to treat everyone badly, because that's against human rights, and that's something that everyone can rally against you if you do something wrong, Mr. Speaker. We don't think it immediately ties to the concept of a Jewish state. Let's move on to my substantive, right? How the removal of identity as a Jewish state harms the concept of nationalism and harms the ability for Israel to mobilize, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, if you remove all identity, then as Terence's speech told you, you cannot connect to this country on a personal level. So now if states base their identity on certain constructs, Mr. Speaker, we think it's legitimate for them to use this construct to call for you to serve your country or to serve with your country, Mr. Speaker. Because without this particular construct that you affiliate yourself to, then that country essentially becomes a generic state, a state without an identity, a state that cannot call its citizens to serve or mobilize under any banner, Mr. Speaker. What happens now is it's hard for you to call for civic nationalism, Mr. Speaker. The harm now is no one that identifies itself as a Jew will want to serve for a state that's not a Jewish state, Mr. Speaker. So what happens is that you're more likely to move out to countries with better education, to countries with a better democratic government, to countries that serve your interests better, Mr. Speaker. We think this is wrong because the presence of it being a Jewish state helps Israel mobilize itself, like mobilize its military, mobilize its education, make sure Jews stay in Israel, Mr. Speaker. We think that this is important for the concretization of Israel as a country. We see this in examples, Mr. Speaker. Countries like Estonia, Greece, and Turkey, Mr. Speaker, where their identity isn't tied to any construct, people are more likely to move out to countries like the Scandinavian countries, like Sweden, where there's better education, Mr. Speaker. But you juxtapose that against Islamic countries who tie themselves with the Islamic banner, Mr. Speaker, then they're more likely to serve because they think that fighting and serving for the country is serving for Islam. We think we should afford Israel the same right and the same ability to call these people out, to serve under that very banner, Mr. Speaker. You harm Israel in the long run. You didn't show us why the removal of the Jewish state will solve any problems, Mr. Speaker. We think we win this debate and we're proud to progress to the finals.
I'd like to thank the Deputy of Opposition for their speech. Please start the closing out of the debate, member of the area.
Testing. We absolutely agree that Israel has the right to their own identity. But this was never a policy debate about forcing Israel to denounce their right to their identity. This was very clearly a value judgment debate if they should or should not proclaim that right to their identity, because they also stand to benefit from not identifying themselves as a Jewish state. That's why Behrad very clearly told you that the bulk of LO's speech is in fact moot. So we're very surprised that the DLO decided to continue that substantiation by saying they had a right to their identity. We very much agree that it's not a clash, it's whether or not Israel and other people and the geopolitical stability in the Middle East stand to benefit from Israel not deciding to claim themselves as a Jewish state. Two extensions from closing government. Firstly, we think the active disassociation from the Jewish identity will alter the fanatical support of the Jewish diaspora outside of Israel, and we think this will change foreign policy standings in the international community. Secondly, we're going to show you why this revolutionizes the political atmosphere of the Middle East to one that makes Israel far more palatable with, of course, more different analysis than what OG told you. But before that, a few rebuttals. Firstly, they said that Israel is a haven for religious pilgrimage and destroying this identity causes psychological harm to all Jewish individuals. Brilliant argumentation from OO. Kudos to you guys, but here are two responses. Number one, we reject your arbitrary definition of Israel as a religious haven because we think there's no such thing as the Jewish pilgrimage. There's no parallel need for the Jewish diaspora to return to Israel in the way that Muslims have to return to Mecca to fulfill a religious obligation. We look at all kinds of religious havens like the Vatican City and Mecca, where immoral activities are completely unheard of because they're filled with ultra-religious communities. In Israel, we have a rising community of atheism, guys, and this obviously does not reflect your concept of a religious haven that is meant for all Jewish people to return to. We think the conceptual definition of Israel as a Jewish state is nothing but political convenience to fuel their discriminatory policies towards Palestinians. We think that's just very convenient. It doesn't actually reflect the religious significance of Israel. But the second response is, we think Jewish individuals outside of Israel are literally not affected at all by whatever happens in Israel. What is this vague, nonsensical harm that was never materialized in any of their speeches? But even if we concede, right, on a trade-off, we're very happy to cause cognitive discomfort to some people if we could avoid very tangible harms like people dying and punishing people who are oppressing other communities, Mr. Speaker. That's why we pass LGBT rights despite conservatives existing, because we don't care that you're uncomfortable if people on the ground are actively being discriminated by your policy, so your harm is really not a good harm in this debate. Second response, they said that Israel's fault are not the faults of conceptual definition of Israel as a Jewish state. We could not disagree more. We think it is mutually exclusive when you talk about the protection of other minority religious communities when you want to force Israel to be defined by a religious externality. We reject their claims that Muslim in a Jewish state can practice their religion and Jewish individuals in Muslim states can practice their religion. That is completely untrue. We've never been at a greater height of discrimination than it is right now. That's why in Malaysia, if you're Jewish, you don't have any kinds of legal protection or any kinds of legal recognition because you don't exist to us if you define yourself as a religious individual in a binary where we reject your religious definition. That's why Jewish individuals in Egypt or in other Muslim states are absolutely discriminated on the ground and they cannot exist and they cannot practice their rights. If you continue to do this, that's when you also have to defend the harm where Arab Palestinians living in Israel are continuously discriminated on a daily basis. Those who are kicked out due to the conflict and civil war with Palestinians don't have the right to return because your political atmosphere is defined as such where we reject anyone who does not belong to the Jewish state. You must defend the discrimination. Unfortunately, it's a little bit too late for that. Let's look at the first extension coming from closing government on how it impacts the Jewish diaspora. But before that, yes, opening.
Why is it attributed to the Jewish state when if your discrimination comes from the fact that a majority of people are Jewish? Does that change any facts on the ground?
It is the fault of this definition because that rhetoric is what empowers those political decisions. If we actively disassociate ourselves from calling ourselves a Jewish state, then your political stance of discriminating other religious communities no longer has political, like you allow yourself to define yourself as a Jewish state. That's what fuels religiously discriminatory policies, and you have to defend that under your model. Impact the Jewish diaspora. We think the basis of Jewish support to Israel is because of the conceptual definition of what Israel represents. The genesis of the Jewish state was derivative from Zionism in a time of great persecution. So Israel is seen now as a haven for persecuted Jews. We think this no longer applies to modern Israel because the fight with our neighbors right now are a geopolitical issue for the autonomy of land. Winning this fight is not a win for Judaism, it's just a win for the sovereign state of Israel. Jews outside of Israel completely unaffected by this particular struggle. But it is the active finally taking of Israel as the beacon of the Jewish state and for Jewish legitimacy is what compels the Jewish diaspora to be politically paranoid and overly protective of the Jewish state, because this is their haven and this is their religion that they have to protect. We think it's a given. The Jewish diaspora everywhere around the world is economically superior and are converting this to political capital via lobbying. In the United States of America, they push for pro-Israeli foreign policies that defies all logical sense. The strength of their support in the international community comes from all these superpower mega states to Israel, even in light of Israel making blatant breaches of international human rights, yet somehow they are exempted from all international enforcement of human rights. Because when you have friends like the US, they veto any kinds of manifestos that stands to disempower you. So right now, all of these superpowers are at the behest of Jewish capital. They own literally a share in almost all of Fox 500, Mr. Speaker, and they all lobby. And now political organizations are at the behest of this Jewish diaspora to tell them that you don't have to support Israel just because you're Jewish is what we need. That active disassociation, that this is a political decision, not a religious decision. You don't have to defend Israel just because we are all from the Jewish father. Secondly, revolutionizing the political atmosphere. They were talking about domestic politics and opening government. Closing government, we're going to tell you why defining yourself as a Jewish state is making you a geographical target within that region. Already you're the perpetrator of so much conflict. We don't think it's an issue when other Muslim states declare themselves as Muslims, although if this was a value judgment debate, we also don't want them to do that. But in the midst of that hostility, you are the religious perpetrator of that conflict. And now you have a coalition of Muslim countries that are all concentrated towards you, which is why in the 6-day war with Israel, it's literally Israel versus 7 other states because of your religious definition within that binary of religious discrimination. Within all political parties within Israel, the only reason they're politically popular is because they're consistent with Zionism, right? If you look at the 2 main political parties, the reason for this is because of the conceptual definition of what it means to be Israel is to be a Jewish state and defend Jewish rights. When you do this, that's when you revolutionize the political atmosphere of domestic politics and international politics for Israel parties to be more palatable and create policy changes such as allowing the right to return into Israel, because you no longer define and discriminate individuals by their religious identity. You do it via pros and cons and merits. We are very happy to destroy a harmful narrative that exists within Israel right now.
I'd like to thank the member of God for their speech to continue the up case, member of Bulgaria.
Yeah.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, your friends don't leave you because of the fact that of your particular religion or the God that you pray to, but rather they leave you because of, of being a bully and, kicking your friends around, ladies and gentlemen, which is something that Israel has done. Israel is being alienated not because of its religion or that it identifies itself culturally as a Jewish state, but rather its policies and its lack of adhering to basic human rights, ladies and gentlemen, something in which the government bench has failed to differentiate between government policies by certain radicals, and the Jewish label in which they identify with, ladies and gentlemen. We of the closing side of the opposition see that it's counterintuitive for the Israeli state, and the Israeli state to, abandon its Jewish label, because at the very end, we have to understand that the origin of Israel in itself is that it was founded under the basic fact that it was land, it was a Jewish land, and to represent the Jews as a whole in the global spectra. Something that can be done greatly, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, I'll go to some of the POIs. Something that I'll point out by the closing government, in which they made a contradiction. For one thing, that they wanted to continue an active dissociation, but still want to maintain its Jewish identity. For one thing, ladies and gentlemen, if the government were to abandon this kind of formal tag of Jewish identity, right, considering itself as a Jewish state, at the end of the day, you cannot differentiate the fact that Israel in itself has a majority majority of Jewish people, ladies and gentlemen. It is a site of various Jewish religious sites, ladies and gentlemen, and a large amount of people who do visit Israel are Jewish. So in some way, it is a Jewish state without even formally calling it a Jewish state, something which the government has failed to tackle, ladies and gentlemen. And for one thing, ladies and gentlemen, that they have to understand is that the reason why that Israel is being hampered with a lot of complaints, ladies and gentlemen, is not because it identifies itself as a Jewish state, but the acts of certain radicals, something which can be negated by still maintaining its Jewish tag, ladies and gentlemen, because it maintains the voices of all Jews within globally, within the global spectrum, something I will elaborate further in my extension, right? So for one thing, ladies and gentlemen, what we differentiate from the opening opposition is that we believe that by maintaining the tag of being a Jewish state is at the end of the day beneficial, because we are able to improve the image of Judaism globally, something which is ineffective, ladies and gentlemen. When you are the only state in the world being a representative of Judaism globally, we understand that you have a form of burden or a form of baggage to carry upon, where you have to take into account the nuances and the various spectrum of Judaism as a whole, ladies and gentlemen, and not adhere to radical Zionism, which is in some way a part of a part of Israel. So at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, Israel does need to carry on or to open up itself to and amend its policies to answer to or represent the greater part of Judaism within the global community, ladies and gentlemen. Something in which we an example that I would like to give is within Saudi Arabia in itself. Saudi Arabia is seen as a Muslim country, and it's seen with traditional policies which does hamper women's rights and the movement of women's in itself, ladies and gentlemen. But Saudi Arabia is pressured within modern times in itself to open its policies, to open to the wider aspects of Islam in itself, and it has even allowed women to some extent drive, something which is a bit small, but is in a great step into humanizing what Muslims are, something in which Israel can do in the large extent. Israel is able to use its image as the only sole Jewish state within the country to amend its kind of image, which has largely been hampered in itself, ladies and gentlemen. But before that, closing.
All of Israel's policy of aggression is premised on the fact that they are protecting their Jewish identity. So why would it removing that premise also remove the moral legitimacy?
Yeah, at the end of the day, we have to understand those are something that are echoed by certain by radical Jews in itself. Jews within outside the country of Israel in itself does have a say and criticize Israel for not representing Judaism as being something open, something we can see whenever there's conflicts between Gaza in itself. The Jewish community are always quick to reprimand Israel for its actions, because it does carry the burden of representing Israel as a Jewish state, ladies and gentlemen. Liberal and moderate Jews in itself reprimand Israel, and also reprimand Israel because of its atrocities, and that it does not showcase that how the Jewish values that these people want. Because at the end of the day, we have to understand that people not only in Israel but around the world itself identify Israel, emotionally identify Israel, because it does represent the values of its religion in itself. So whenever Israel does this kind of atrocities or commit crimes against humanity, ladies and gentlemen, it is a form of check and balance which is essential in maintaining in ensuring that Israel is kept in check, ladies and gentlemen. Something in which their paradigm kind of neglects, ladies and gentlemen. Just because we remove the term of being a Jewish state does not ensure that these atrocities will not happen, ladies and gentlemen. Jewish support for Israel is there. Why not capitalize on it, ladies and gentlemen? And also the Jewish support for Israel in itself is very moderate, or to a certain case liberal in itself. So to where people will reprimand Israel towards social media, towards their governments in itself, towards boycotts from different countries, to ensuring that Israel does listen to their voices outside and also inside in itself, ladies and gentlemen. Something that they have been neglecting. Okay, opening.
Okay, see, what you think by having a legitimate Jewish identity, you are further empowering the Jewish extremist political force and further degrading the
yes, please. At the end of the day, we have to understand in the wider spectrum of Judaism in itself, there are liberal narratives, there are moderate narratives who can counter these radicals in itself, who tend to represent Israel in a horrifying light, right? Because we have to understand, image of a religion or representing a bigger part of religion itself does carry a form of weight, ladies and gentlemen. The reasons why anti-Semitism increased during the Gazan war in France in itself was basically because people associated Israel for its negative policies. If Israel were to improve on, representing Judaism in a far much more open scenario, ladies and gentlemen, people's mindsets will be changed because, for one, they now identify Israel and by extension Jews in the end as people who are a bit more open, and we see a potential for Israel to do so and to adhere to these kinds of open mindset and to the greater representation of the Judean spectrum, because Israel in itself are partners with Western civilizations, are partner with the Western world, ladies and gentlemen. People who can pressure Israel in itself to represent Israel in a greater part, or to not neglect these kinds of various nuances within the Jewish spectra. For that, we kindly oppose.
I'd like to thank the member of the speech to now conclude the Gov case. I'd like to invite the Gov to carry.
Mr. Speaker, in 1948, the UN, led by Britain, helped establish the State of Israel, a state that was underpinned with the concept of Zionism in order to create a safe haven for persecuted Jews across Europe. This concept is no longer relevant today. Therefore, we think the opposition did not debate this motion in 2014. We would like to invite the opposition whip to get out of the era of the 1940s post-World War II, ladies and gentlemen. We think also that the opposition didn't manage to show to us what are the consequences of identifying or tagging yourself as a Jewish state. There are 4 consequences of calling yourself a Jewish state. Firstly, it justifies the discrimination of ethnic Palestinians living in Israel. It is the same rhetoric that we have in Malaysia, where ultra-nationalist Malays says to the Indian and Chinese, go back to China and India. It is a Jewish state, and therefore it empowers the rhetoric of ultra-nationalist Jews to tell ethnic Palestinians to get out of their homeland. Secondly, it justifies discriminatory policies within the Knesset, within Israel. We see ethnic Palestinian not getting equal property rights, not getting educational opportunity, not getting equal economic rights, because all of the policies in Israel prioritize the Jews. Thirdly, it empowers xenophobic immigration policies. Now, the right of Palestinians that were kicked out of their homeland in 1948 and 1967, they cannot come back because it is considered a Jewish state, and it is a nation's policy to maintain that supremacy, ladies and gentlemen. And we think these are horrible things that the opposition did not want to defend in today's debate. Furthermore, we disagree with the characterization that there are moderate and liberal voices within Israel. Kadima and Likud are on the right of the political spectrum, ladies and gentlemen, because it is identified itself as a Jewish state. It continues the insecurity of the Jewish people and the paranoia of the Jewish people that they experienced in 1940s. Nowadays, there's no guy, there's no despotic leader with a mini mustache persecuting Jews, ladies and gentlemen, in the world. There's no reason why we should still maintain a safe haven for Jews. Let's first look at the psychological comfort that opening opposition wanted to talk about. As I mentioned, this is not 1940s. Therefore, the psychological comfort that you want, is not exclusive to Israel, because Jews can live anywhere in the world without being persecuted in this day and age. Secondly, we don't think that you can't be able to maintain your identity as a Jew within Israel if it identifies itself as a liberal democracy. You can still pray under a liberal democracy, ladies and gentlemen. You can still have Jewish vernacular schools that teach us in Hebrew, ladies and gentlemen. We think you can still have public holidays to celebrate Jewish religious and cultural festivals, ladies and gentlemen. So we think the maintenance of the Jewish identity can coexist with a liberal democracy as compared to calling itself a Jewish state. Now, thirdly, they said that this will harm nationalism. We abhor Jewish nationalism, ladies and gentlemen. We think that if you want to call your citizens to come and serve for you, it should be based on civic nationalism. And we think you can still achieve all the benefits of nationalism that you want if you allow civil nationalism as compared to a more exclusive nationalism that only calls for Jewish people to fight for that nation state. We want ethnic Palestinians to feel like Israel is their home as well. We want them to equally contribute to the Israeli civic society and live normally there. Lastly, we want to debunk this red herring about comparing Israel to Christian and Islamic nations. We think that those nations have their strategy to call themselves Islamic State, and that is up for debate. We can have another debate on a different day about whether or not Saudi should continue to be an Islamic state, because we don't think the context and realities of those states is similar to the state of Israel, ladies and gentlemen. This debate is whether or not it is strategic for Israel to disassociate itself from the Jewish state. But before I go on even further, yes, Muayyad.
America is a secular country with a huge Christian population. These guys have a large say in domestic policy. How does the same scenario not happen in your secular Israel when an even larger majority is Jewish and extremist, as you just conceded in your speech?
Because now when politicians come out to justify policies or to call people to do certain things, they can't say, do it because this is a Jewish state. Don't do it because you have to prioritize our Jewish identity, and they can't say it is justified for you to sideline other people, ladies and gentlemen. That is not, in America, politicians are unable to say that because it is political suicide. In Israel, Likud and Kadima politicians can say that because it is underpinned by Zionism and the Jewish state, and we think that has to stop. Why is this conceptual change from a state that is underpinned by Zionism to a state that is one of a liberal democracy, particularly in Israel's best interest? Firstly, Mai told you that it will no longer be a geographical target because it's not exclusive to Jews anymore. That means ethnic Palestinians and Muslims living in Israel will be enfranchised, ladies and gentlemen. That means before Hamas and Hezbollah fire rockets into Israel, they know that their fellow brothers and sisters that are enfranchised and identify themselves as Israelis will be harmed, which means that a lot of Islamic terrorist organization or Islamic State will no longer be able to say, wipe off Israel out of the world map, for example, from the country where my friend comes from. That is a famous rhetoric that has been used in Iran, ladies and gentlemen. Now Iranians cannot say that anymore because their fellow brothers and sisters that are enfranchised within these countries will be harmed as well. Secondly, we tell you that this will give legitimacy. Currently, the status quo gives legitimacy to Jewish diaspora being persecuted in Islamic countries like in Syria, like in Egypt, ladies and gentlemen, because they use the same rhetoric. You have a Jewish state. Go back to your state. Why are you here in our country, ladies and gentlemen? We think if you disassociate yourself from calling yourself a Jewish state, then it's no longer seen as a home for Jews, ladies and gentlemen. That means a lot more people will be amiable to Jewish people living in places like Syria, Egypt, America, because they can't say, go back to your homeland, ladies and gentlemen. We also tell you that it makes it far more easier for United States to support a secular state because it's principally consistent with Israeli principle, but it also doesn't look unreasonable anymore for the US to continue its support for Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many benefits of Israel rebranding itself into a liberal democracy and so much overwhelming harms for them to be an exclusive, a racist, a xenophobic state, ladies and gentlemen, and that's why you should vote for side of government.
I'd like to thank Iqbal for the speech, now including the debate. Iqbal.
Ladies and gentlemen, the entire government bench arguments are based on a glaring assumption whereby they see it as if Israeli, they only associate Israeli atrocities with Israel being a Jewish state, right? Whereas they never actually tell us about how turning secular or denouncing the predicate of being a Jewish state will actually stop Israel from being belligerent in the first place, right? But there also a glaring, contradiction in the closing government, right? Where my actually count saying that they want to actively dissociate Israel from the predicate of being a Jewish state, but still they want to keep identity. We don't believe that the Jewish identity will still be as solid as now compared to when under their paradigm, right? So that is a contradiction itself, right? Moving on to my first rebuttals, right? I have 3 direct rebuttals to their case, right? On the discrimination of Palestinians, for example, or Jewish, or the Jews, right? For example, when you are a Jewish state, right? We believe that this kind of discrimination, especially towards Arabs or Palestinians in Israel, right, will still occur even if Israel is secular, right? Because the people are still have the same mindset as they have before, and we believe that even if Israel is a Jewish state, we believe that check and balance are there. How? By something that Haikal extended, right, on the greater pressure towards the Jews on actually keeping them, keeping Israel, more media friendly or something like that, because Israel, if they actually keep their Jewish state predicate, they will essentially be a mirror towards the entire Jewish race in the world, right? So we see that having that form of check and balance will ensure that Israel try not to be too racist and so forth, right? Okay. On second rebuttal, right, on the Jewish diaspora, right, on how Shafiq mentioned on Israel is no longer the haven for persecuted Jews because time has moved on and so on and so forth, right? We believe that this kind of complacency does not play in the Jewish minds, right? The Jewish people's minds, right? And these are the main contingents who are actually the allies of Israel, right? On those who actually fund Israel, right? Those people who actually fund Israel due to its nature of being a Jewish state, right? Sit down. We believe that we reject the characterization of Jews not persecuted. We believe that Jews are still persecuted, even if in the United States, right? How anti-Semitism is still a prevalent issue, right? So we don't see that coming from side closing government, right? And this ultimately will affect the support from the allies as well, right? On how these the allies are actually contingent towards Israel being a Jewish state, right? Sit down. And thirdly, on the right wings of Israel in Israel using Jewish state as a rhetoric, rhetoric matter, right? So we believe that these political parties will still be in Israel in the first place, right? Even if Israel denounce its Jewish state, Jewish state's predicate, right? On how they will still fight for whatever fight that they are actually doing, right? And even so, it will be even more aggressive because Israel is no longer a Jewish state, and they feel threatened by the status quo because Israel is now moving towards secularism, which is something that do not want, and hence they will be more aggressive and so forth. With that, before moving on to the clashes closing.
It's not a burden to say that once the announcement is made, Israel suddenly becomes completely peace-loving. It is our burden to say that the political atmosphere under the announcement is more likely for all of these changes to happen. You haven't proven the counter.
Look, we believe that simply denouncing, this is brilliant, because we believe that they actually believe that denouncing equals dissociation, right? Whereby they believe that simply by denouncing, it's like denouncing that Israel is actually a Jewish state. Hamas, for example, will stop attributing the Jews or Judaism with Israel, right? Because at the end of the day, Israel is home for the majority. Israel is still constituting of majority of Jews, right? So we believe that that association will still be there regardless of them actually denouncing the idea of Jewish states in the first place, right? So moving on to the clashes of today's debate, I have two clashes, right? Firstly, on sit down, will anti-Semitic rhetorics be reduced by Israel declaring secularism? And second, will allies actually pull up from Israel by now denouncing their own Jewish state, right? Firstly, on will anti-Semitic rhetorics be reduced, right? We believe that their arguments are based on assumption whereby if Israel actually declares secularism, people will dissociate Judaism with Israel, right? And this is not something that is actually true. We reject this mischaracterization, right? Because even after years of conflict, it's already being deep-seated among Palestinians, among the people around the world, right? How Israel is home for the Jews, right? On how and CG actually agreed that this identity still persists, right? And we believe that For example, right, we believe that it's actually better for Israel in the first place to actually keep its Jewish statehood, Jewish state predicate, right? On how harm will still be there in both cases, even if they declare secularist, right? Sit down. For example, right, if actually Israel denounces its Jewish statehood, right, any negative actions Israel take will still be attributed to the Jews, right? For example, a race policy or segregation and etc. Sit down. It will still be attributed to Judaism, right? Secularism or denouncing a Jewish being a Jewish state does not mean that you are actually you can actually escape those kind of negative connotations, right? But even this is where our extension comes in, right? Where benefits will actually be amplified if Israel actually keeps its Jewish state claim, right? On how, for example, right, if Malaysia allows women to drive, the narrative will be that it's seen as secularism in Malaysia actually curbing Islamic, Islam and so forth, right? But when we see how Saudi Arabia, an Islamic country, actually allows women to drive, it will be seen as progressiveness of Islam, right? So where Islam actually allows civil liberties to thrive and so forth, right? So this is where we believe that if Israel actually, if Israel actually keep its claim on being a Jewish state, we believe that the views of people towards the Jews, for example, will be better mended if Israel actually keeps its Jewish statehood. Right? With that, I'm proud to host.